Hello, my name's Philip Dawson and I'd like to talk with you about what the student does when we aren't around. So we being the teacher. So as with a lot of the other stuff I say, it's prefaced on learning is what the student does, and there we're kind of mangling what Big says. So learning is really about what students are doing, not so much about what we as teachers are doing. In this video, I'd like to focus on, well, how do students spend their out of class time? And I'd like to do a specific focus on tasks, things that students might do out of class, and a focus on the students themselves, what's actually going on within students when they're doing these out of class tasks, and go through a bit of an example with, well, should we record lectures? This is a recorded lecture, so I hope the answer is yes. And you might have seen this before. This is data from the Aussie Survey, which is the Australasian Survey of Student Engagement. It's as presented in a research briefing by the Australian Council for Education Research. We've looked at a few different parts of this before, but today we're really going to be focusing on one particular part. It's this preparing for class part. We've got about 10-ish hours per week. What are students doing in those 10 hours? Well, what does it look like? Is it, some readings? Is it studying their notes? Is it being on the discussion forum? Is it going through your tutorial worksheet questions? And bear in mind, this is 10 hours per week spread across a study load that includes multiple units usually. We don't know. I don't know what your students are doing out of class. Do you know what they're doing? When the students say to you, well, how should I spend my homework time on your unit? They've got that time. It might only be about 2 or 3 hours per week they're willing to give to your unit. What should they be doing? You know what they should be doing. You know what that sort of pie chart is going to look like for your unit. Try and make that a really explicit, clear communication to the students. I expect you will spend a couple of hours on the readings and work through the questions that are attached to each of these readings and synthesize those into notes for the final exam, or whatever it is. But make that communication really clear and explicit. So the other one is, well, why should I spend my homework time on your unit? They've got those 10-ish hours per week. If they can get away with not spending it on your unit, maybe they can spend it on another unit or on something even more rewarding. If you sort of respond with, so you don't fall behind, that could be a less than compelling answer for a student sometimes. Ideally, the unit itself, by its design, communicates why students should be doing stuff out of class, because you have designed this unit that has perfect constructive alignment. The objectives or outcomes are really clearly, explicitly stated. The teaching and learning activities work towards students' achievement of that, and the assessment evaluates that. But does your unit actually do that? When we're looking at teaching and learning there, teaching and learning includes beyond just what we do in the classroom. It includes what we expect students to do out of the classroom as well. So the homework activities need to be aligned, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of the level of outcomes. So think about the units that you teach. Do you have these extended abstract sort of outcomes and assessment, but set homework tasks which are multi-structural? Homework tasks where students need to come up with a list of all of the bones in the hand, but you set these assessments or outcomes that are about the structure, the function of the hand. So how does it all work together? And if I was going to make a bionic hand, how would I do that? That's sort of extended abstract level stuff. There are some sorts of outcomes on our solo taxonomy here that are particularly suited to certain designs of homework. I'll focus a little bit on problem solving because a lot of our units tend to deal with problem solving outcomes. Problem solving exists largely at that relational level. So if I want students to get good at problem solving, they're not going to get good at that by a bunch of multi-structural tasks, and they're probably not going to be ready for extended abstract tasks. Yeah, we know this. One of the best ways to teach problem solving is by having worked examples of how to solve similar problems, interspersing them with students doing similar problems to those, and maybe a variety of classes of problems. So think about the particular level of outcome you're after and think about whether the homework tasks you set for students cover off on that sort of outcome or just on the broad content, because students will be able to pick it up if what they're doing isn't going to help them in the exam or the assessment. We know from research that homework impacts on some things. Getting students to do homework, I've used this word homework a few times, it's the stuff students do out of class, yeah? We know that students doing stuff out of class, homework, impacts on achievement. So students who do homework get better grades. This is fantastic. This is a compelling reason for students to do homework. It also impacts on self-efficacy about learning. So that's a student's belief in their ability to have an impact on their own learning. Students who do homework end up having more positive belief about their ability to impact on their own learning. It impacts on independent learning and study skills. Students who do more homework become more independent learners and develop this set of skills they need to do that. Students who just go to your classes and do your assessment but don't do anything else don't really develop that independence and don't develop the skills they need. Now, these are really important things to be a lifelong learner. Most professions expect people to continue to learn. If you don't do homework, you won't develop as that independent learner, which is really necessary to be a professional. Also impacts on beliefs of responsibility for learning. So students who do homework end up believing that it's actually their responsibility to do the learning. I'm trying to communicate to you in my lectures that learning is what the student does. Students who do homework believe that. They believe that they are the ones who have to do the learning. And it impacts on self-regulatory development. So let's focus a little bit on that self-regulatory development, or the concept of being a self-regulated learner. Here we have a diagram, and I've got a link to the paper that diagram's from as well, and a section of it for you to read. It's a 4-phase model of self-regulated learning. Now, rather than describe what self-regulated learning is up front, I'll go through this cycle here and you might be able to figure it out. So let's say you start the homework task. The homework task is working through a particular set of maths problems. In phase 1 of regulating your own learning, you're going to be doing some forethought. You're going to be thinking, well, what maths problems do I have to do here? I might plan out, I might set aside a particular amount of time. And a self-regulated learner also activates prior knowledge. So they think, well, it's this sort of maths problem. Now that actually builds upon this other stuff I've done before, but it also builds upon this stuff I learned in that other course. So the first part of regulating your own learning, if you're a student, is forethought, planning, activating prior knowledge. And then you start doing the work. So you move on to phase 2, you're acting. And as you go, you're monitoring, and you're finding that this question is actually really hard, and I don't think I actually know all the things I need to know to do it. I thought I was activating that prior knowledge before, but it turns out I've got this gap in there. Or some of monitoring can be that noise that's happening over there is really annoying. I better do something about that. Or part of self-regulated learning can be I've got a headache. Or part of self-regulated learning can be I need to flag this is really important stuff, I'll have to revisit it later. The third phase of being a self-regulated learner is around control and acting. So that's where I realised before I didn't know enough stuff. I'm going to follow up on that. And you get out that other book and follow up the how-to for this sort of problem. I'm going to go and turn off that thing that's making the annoying noise. I'm going to take a Panadol to deal with the pain. I'm going to write down that this thing is actually probably likely to be in the exam. So a self-regulated learner, our ideal student, is doing all of those things somewhat consciously in their brain. Not automatically, but they're consciously going, I don't know enough, I do know enough, these things are impeding my learning, and then acting on those things. And then our fourth phase here of being a self-regulated learner is around reaction and reflection. I'm at the end of my study session. What happened? Well, I learned that, but it took me an hour and I didn't really get very far. What was the cause of that? Reaction and reflection also happens after things like an exam. So I've studied, I've worked for it, I've gone to the exam, I've done it. Those two questions were really hard. They came out of nowhere. Or I get my mark back and my mark is what I expected. My mark isn't what I expected. Why is that so? So our ideal student is doing all of these things. They are regulating their learning as they go and they're maintaining some sort of a dialogue in their head. I'd like you to read this chunk of this article here about student motivation and self-regulated learning. It says in the college classroom there, I think that's a bad title, it's mostly about stuff outside of the classroom. Just those pages there. It's a particularly long article, and if you want you can read the whole thing and it's actually quite enlightening, but those are the articles dealing with our self-regulated learning process. So let's think about a problem. Let's think about recording lectures or not recording lectures. Well, a self-regulated learning perspective on should we record lectures and have them available to students might say, the point of entry to recorded lectures is high. You've got to be a relatively self-regulated learner to watch the lecture. Self-regulated learning also impacts on motivation. You may just choose to do something else. You then have this issue of attending the lecture versus watching a video. Now, if students are given the choice, which of those two scenarios requires more self-regulation? It's a lot harder to get up and go to the fridge and get something to eat in the lecture. It's probably equally easy to be on Facebook at the same time in the recorded lecture or the face-to-face lecture. But self-regulated learning acts somewhat differently in a synchronous face-to-face real-time setting versus the recorded lecture. You can pause anytime. Feel free to pause me. Particular affordances might suit self-regulation. So a recorded lecture allows you to jump in and pause and look up that word that I said that you didn't understand. It allows you to fast forward or skip bits that you already know in advance. So there are particular things about recorded lectures that make them really great for self-regulated learners. An alternative perspective is kind of an economic perspective, and this is by a former student in a unit that I taught. An economics perspective might suggest that recorded lectures might have different incentives. That what you get out of going to class versus what you get out of the lecture recording might be different. That if you've got access to the recorded lecture, you might get everything you need out of it and choose not to go to the face-to-face class, and that might have some negative consequences. There's issues of substitutability or complementarity here. Is the lecture recording a good substitute for the face-to-face lecture, or is it a complementary thing? Do you want people to be doing both? Students out of class might rewatch your lecture, they might not. And issues of absenteeism. So students might just stop showing up to the face-to-face lectures. Is that a problem? That's up to you. So you can see here that we've got two perspectives on whether we should record lectures or not. I'm flagging up this economics perspective because I want you to think about your own discipline and theory in your own discipline and how that might inform students' decisions to go to recorded lectures or not, or other issues around self-regulation and homework. My argument to you is that whether we record lectures or not really depends on learner and course characteristics. Who are your learners? Are they first year on-campus students who really need that face-to-face with you? Are they busy professionals undertaking an MBA? In those two circumstances, your content might be really, really different and your learners are really different, and their time and availability to come to campus, those are all really different. Whether you have the lecture as this face-to-face thing or the lecture as a homework task, I argue it depends on learner and course characteristics. See some homework for you on homework. I'd like you to find out what your students are doing for homework. What do they do? Now, asking them about this, what did you do for homework this week? What did you do out of class? You might get the answer they think you want to hear. So perhaps think about phrasing it a little differently. Perhaps something like, find a student, ask them, what do you think most students in this course are doing for homework each week out of class? How much time do you think they're spending? Do you think your friends are going through the textbook or whatever? Find ways to make it not be about the student admitting they haven't done any work, because that's not the aim of this. The aim of this is to find out what the typical students in your course do each week out of class. In addition, I'd like you to choose a piece of self-regulation and try to teach it. These are teachable things. We have probably developed these over time because we ended up getting our degrees and we're pretty good students, evidently. We teach now. You might already do these things, but when was the last time you showed a student your planning for study? Or you talked about how you monitor yourself when you're solving these problems? Or you talked about the actions you take in response to distractions or a lack of prior knowledge or a lack of time? How do you prioritize different tasks? And when was the last time you demonstrated reflecting about learning to your students? You, as the expert learner in your discipline, are in a privileged position to show students how you regulate your time and do planning, monitoring, controlling, and reflection. So I'd like to set that for you for some homework for this week. Thanks a lot.